Secrets of the Ancient Tycoons. Chapter 1. The Men Who Understood Power Before Money. Before money had symbols. Before banks existed. Before numbers replaced favors. There were men who controlled entire regions without ever touching a coin. They were not loud. They were not famous in the way modern success is advertised. They did not rush. They understood something most people still don't understand today. Wealth is not created by chasing money. It is created by positioning yourself so money has no choice but to come to you. The ancient tycoons didn't ask, "How do I earn more?" They asked something far more dangerous. "How do I become necessary?" And once you are necessary, wealth stops being something you pursue. It becomes something that flows toward you naturally. The first forgotten law: control the flow, not the product. Most people believe wealth comes from producing something, farming more land, building more goods, selling more items. That belief keeps them busy, tired, replaceable. Ancient tycoons never focused on production. They focused on control points, trade routes, water access, storage facilities, information channels, alliances. They didn't grow the grain. They controlled the road the grain had to travel on. They didn't mine the metal. They owned the place where metal was weighed, taxed, approved. They didn't fight the wars. They funded both sides quietly. And here's the part people miss. When you control the flow, you collect value without effort. You don't work harder. You position smarter. Why power always precedes wealth. Ancient tycoons understood something modern society tries to hide. Money is weak without power. Power creates money, but money does not always create power. Power meant influence over decisions, control over timing, access to information before others, the ability to delay or accelerate outcomes. Once power was secured, money became a side effect. That's why many ancient fortunes survived wars, collapses, and regime changes. Kings fell, empires burned, currencies vanished, but the tycoons remained, because they didn't depend on systems. They were embedded inside them. Silence was their loudest weapon. Ancient tycoons did not advertise. They did not announce success. They did not draw attention. Visibility creates enemies. Silence creates leverage. They spoke last, moved slowly, and let others expose their intentions first. They listened more than they talked. And when they spoke, it was measured, calculated, unavoidable. This is why they survived political chaos. Everyone else reacted emotionally. They observed. Everyone else rushed. They waited. And waiting, when done correctly, is not weakness. It is dominance. They built wealth through obligation, not transactions. Modern people trade transactions. Ancient tycoons built obligations. They helped during famine, funded rebuilding after disaster, provided protection when systems failed. But nothing was free. They never demanded repayment immediately. They let gratitude mature into dependence. Years later, when decisions were made, when alliances shifted, when power was redistributed, their name surfaced quietly. We owe him. Obligation lasts longer than contracts, and loyalty compounds faster than interest. The illusion of hard work. The ancient tycoon viewed hard labor as inefficient, not because work is bad, but because exhaustion reduces awareness. Tired men make poor decisions. Busy men miss patterns. Overworked men accept bad terms. They conserved energy, protected their mental clarity, and invested effort only where leverage existed. They worked on systems, not inside them. And that distinction separated rulers from workers. Time was their greatest asset. Ancient tycoons thought in generations, not quarters, not years. Generations. They planted trees knowing they would never sit in the shade. They built structures their grandchildren would inherit. Short-term gain was considered dangerous because it revealed impatience. They understood that time amplifies structure. A bad structure collapses faster over time. A strong structure becomes unstoppable. Why these secrets were never written clearly. Most ancient wealth knowledge was transmitted orally, through families, through apprenticeships, through silence, because written knowledge can be stolen, but understanding must be earned. They hid truth inside stories, rituals, traditions. Only those who observed carefully, who asked the right questions, who noticed patterns, were allowed closer. This wasn't elitism. It was protection, because power in the wrong hands destroys itself. The modern world changed. The laws didn't. The tools changed. The language changed. The currency changed. But the laws of wealth did not. Control flows. Own leverage. Stay quiet. Build obligation. Think long-term. Protect clarity. These were not ancient tricks. They were foundational laws. And anyone who understands them today operates with an unfair advantage. Chapter 2. How Scarcity Was Engineered, Not Discovered. Scarcity was never an accident, it was never bad luck, and it was never something the ancient tycoons simply reacted to. Scarcity was designed carefully, patiently, often years in advance. Most people believed shortages happened because of droughts, wars, or fate, but the tycoons knew better. They understood that perception controls value more than reality ever could. A thing becomes precious not when it disappears, but when people believe it might disappear, and belief spreads faster than truth. They did not hoard openly. That would invite resistance, suspicion, rebellion. Instead, they slowed the flow, quietly, subtly adjusting access just enough to create anxiety without chaos. Markets would feel tight, whispers would begin, prices would rise before anyone could point to a reason, and by the time the shortage was visible, positioning was already complete. What made this powerful was not greed, it was restraint. They resisted the urge to profit immediately, because they understood something most people never learn. Extracting value too early kills future leverage. Patience allowed fear to ferment, and fear, once mature, multiplies value without effort. Scarcity works best when it feels natural, inevitable, beyond human control. So the tycoons stayed invisible, letting weather take the blame, letting politics absorb the anger, letting merchants argue among themselves, while quietly controlling storage, timing, and release points. And when relief finally came, or when goods returned, when pressure eased, it always came through channels they controlled. They were not seen as villains. They were seen as saviors. This is the paradox most people never understand. Those who create scarcity carefully are often celebrated when they end it. Fear was not something ancient tycoons avoided. It was something they understood deeply. They knew fear narrows thinking, accelerates decision-making, and makes people accept terms they would normally reject. Fear compresses time horizons. It turns long-term thinkers into short-term survivors. But they never used fear loudly. No threats, no force, no violence unless absolutely unavoidable. Fear was allowed to emerge naturally, through uncertainty, through delayed answers, through silence. Silence was especially powerful. When leaders spoke too often, people stopped listening. When markets were constantly reassured, people grew suspicious. But when silence stretched just long enough, imagination filled the gap, and imagination is always more frightening than reality. Ancient tycoons mastered this. They understood that absence communicates more than presence. A delayed response, a meeting postponed, a shipment slowed without explanation. These small absences created ripples far beyond their size. And once fear entered the system, The Tycoons did something unexpected. They waited. They did not rush to capitalize. They observed who panicked, who sold early, who begged, who stayed calm, because moments of fear reveal true hierarchy. They show who has reserves, who has patience, who has vision. And information gathered during fear is more valuable than gold. Patience was their greatest weapon, not because they enjoyed waiting, but because waiting filtered the weak from the strong. Those who could not tolerate uncertainty exposed themselves. Those who needed immediate relief surrendered leverage willingly. By the time action was taken, the outcome was already decided. Scarcity also trained obedience without commands. When access becomes uncertain, people adapt their behavior automatically. They align themselves with perceived stability. They move closer to those who seem unaffected. The Tycoons understood this instinctively. They positioned themselves as calm, steady, untouched by turbulence. Not because they were immune, but because they had prepared. Preparation removes panic, and calm attracts power. This is why ancient wealth rarely disappeared suddenly. It was insulated, layered, protected by foresight. While others reacted, they executed. And here is the most unsettling truth. Scarcity does not need to be permanent. It only needs to last long enough to reset expectations. Once people accept less, once they recalibrate desire, once urgency rewires behavior, normal never returns to what it was before. The ancient Tycoons reshaped reality this way, not by force, not by deception alone, but by understanding how the human mind responds to uncertainty. And the modern world still operates on the same mechanisms, only the language has changed. Markets, supply chains, attention, information, energy, all obey the same ancient rules. Those who understand scarcity control outcomes. Those who don't experience them. Chapter 3. Power without the throne and loyalty that outlived empires. The greatest illusion in ancient history was that power sat on thrones, wore crowns, commanded armies, and made speeches before crowds. That illusion kept attention pointed in the wrong direction, because while rulers were busy being visible, issuing decrees, defending borders, and feeding egos, another class of men operated quietly beneath the surface, shaping outcomes without ever appearing responsible for them. Ancient Tycoons did not rule kingdoms, they outlasted them. They understood something rulers rarely did: authority expires, but influence adapts. Kings could be overthrown, dynasties could fall, flags could change. But the man who controlled logistics, loyalty, and access never needed a crown to survive the transition. He simply shifted alignment calmly, without drama, while others burned. This is why ancient Tycoons avoided the throne intentionally. Visibility creates targets. Titles create resentment. Power without visibility creates longevity. They let others fight for recognition, while they position themselves as indispensable behind the scenes. Alliances were their true currency, but not the kind written in treaties or declared publicly. Those were fragile, temporary, easily broken. The alliances that mattered were personal, emotional, embedded in obligation and mutual survival. A ruler might change, but a man who once saved your family during famine, who protected your trade route when others attacked, who quietly funded your rise when no one believed in you, that man was never forgotten. Ancient Tycoons invested in people the way others invested in land, patiently, selectively, with long memory. They understood that loyalty cannot be purchased cheaply, but once earned, it compounds more powerfully than interest. Marriages were not romance, they were architecture. Bloodlines were bridges. Children were future alliances still too young to betray. But here's what made the Tycoons different from rulers. They never tied themselves to one side alone. They married across factions. They maintained relationships with rivals. They helped quietly without forcing exclusivity. This gave them optionality. If one house fell, they were welcomed by another. If one empire collapsed, they already had roots elsewhere. If one ruler turned hostile, they had leverage built years before. They were never trapped because they never overcommit emotionally. Emotional attachment was considered dangerous. They observed loyalty, but rarely demanded it. Demand creates resistance. Voluntary loyalty creates devotion. This is why ancient tycoons often appeared neutral, even passive. But neutrality was not weakness. It was strategic ambiguity. No one knew exactly where they stood, which made everyone cautious about crossing them. And caution is a form of power. They cultivated reputations that traveled faster than their names. Not loud reputations, not exaggerated legends, but quiet ones. He keeps his word. He remembers favors. He does not rush. He does not panic. He survives every transition. Reputation, once established, reduced friction, deals closed faster, resistance softened, doors opened before being knocked on. Reputation was a silent army. Ancient tycoons also understood something modern minds struggle with. Conflict reveals hierarchy. During peace, everyone claims loyalty. During stability, everyone smiles. But when pressure arrives, when resources tighten, when risk appears, true alliances reveal themselves. This is why tycoons did not fear chaos. They used it as a diagnostic tool. Who stayed loyal when it cost them something? Who disappeared when advantage faded? Who overplayed their hand? Chaos clarified relationships better than decades of calm. And once clarity was gained, adjustments were made quietly. Support was redirected. Access was limited. Favor was withdrawn. No confrontation, no drama. Just repositioning. This ability to detach emotionally from relationships while still honoring loyalty was one of their most dangerous skills. They did not confuse kindness with weakness, nor generosity with obligation. Every relationship existed within a structure, and structures were maintained meticulously. The tycoons also mastered the art of being needed without being resented. They offered solutions before problems became crises. They arrived early. They left late. They never humiliated those in power. Even when they had leverage, they used it gently, because humiliation breeds revenge, and revenge destroys long-term wealth. Instead, they allowed others to save face. They framed assistance as partnership. They made power feel shared, even when it wasn't. This kept alliances stable across generations. Children inherited not just wealth, but relationships, not just assets, but access, not just land, but loyalty networks already in place. And when empires collapsed, as all eventually do, these networks survived. Borders shifted, currencies vanished, laws changed, but relationships endured. That is why ancient tycoons did not panic during upheaval. They had already invested in continuity. They understood a truth most people resist. Systems change. Human nature does not. Fear, gratitude, ambition, loyalty, self-interest. These forces remain constant. So the tycoons built systems aligned with human nature, not against it. They never tried to control everything. They controlled connection points, and connection points outlast authority. This is why history remembers kings, but wealth remembers builders. Men whose names were rarely carved in stone, yet whose bloodlines, influence, and structures quietly persisted, long after the crowns were dust. Chapter 4: Power, Timing, and the Invisible Game. The ancient tycoons understood something most people still miss today. Wealth was never only about effort or intelligence. It was about timing, positioning, and understanding invisible forces that move markets, empires, and human behavior long before money ever changes hands. They didn't rush. They watched. They listened. They waited until the moment was ripe, and then they moved with precision that looked effortless to outsiders. To the untrained eye it seemed like luck. To those who knew, it was mastery. In the ancient world, power didn't announce itself loudly. It whispered. Merchants who survived for generations learned to sense shifts before they appeared in public view. They noticed when grain supplies subtly tightened, when caravans slowed just enough to signal unrest, when rulers changed advisors rather than policies. These signals mattered more than proclamations. Wealth followed those who could read the room of civilization itself. The tycoons never chased opportunities. Chasing was a sign of desperation. Instead, they built positions where opportunity would eventually come to them. Land near future trade routes. Storage near ports that hadn't yet grown busy. Relationships with families who were quiet but rising. They invested in patience the way others invested in gold. And patience paid compounding returns. Timing, to them, was not about speed. It was about restraint. Knowing when not to act separated dynasties from gamblers. They understood that acting too early drained resources and credibility. Acting too late made you irrelevant. So they trained themselves to live in uncertainty without panic. To sit with incomplete information. To wait while others exhausted themselves reacting. This calm dominance became their unfair advantage. Power itself was treated carefully. The tycoons knew that visible power attracts enemies, taxes, and betrayal. Invisible power attracts options. So they stayed one step behind the throne, never on it. Funding kings without becoming one. Influencing policy without drafting it. Owning supply chains while letting others argue over titles. This shadow position allowed wealth to flow uninterrupted. They mastered the psychology of leverage. Leverage wasn't always money. It was information. It was access. It was being the only person who could solve a specific problem at the exact moment it became urgent. When famine loomed, they controlled storage. When war brewed, they controlled logistics. When peace returned, they controlled rebuilding. At every stage, they positioned themselves where demand would spike, not where noise was loudest. The ancient tycoons also understood cycles deeply. Nothing grew forever. Nothing collapsed without warning. Boom carried the seeds of bust. Bust carried the seeds of rebirth. While crowds celebrated abundance, the tycoons quietly reduced exposure. While crowds panicked, they quietly accumulated assets at absurd discounts. Emotion was the tax the masses paid. Discipline was the dividend the tycoons collected. They never argued with cycles. They aligned with them. When expansion was inevitable, they expanded conservatively. When contraction arrived, they conserved aggressively. This rhythm became instinctual, not learned from books, but from observing nature, seasons, human behavior, and history repeating itself endlessly. One of their greatest secrets was multi-generational thinking. They didn't ask, "How much can I make?" They asked, "What position ensures my bloodline never starts from zero again?" Wealth was architecture, not income. Systems outlived individuals. Contracts outlived memories. Assets were designed to transfer silently rather than spectacularly. They avoided extremes. Extreme risk. Extreme visibility. Extreme dependency on any single ruler, trade, or commodity. Diversification wasn't modern theory to them. It was survival wisdom. Spread influence across regions. Spread investments across seasons. Spread alliances across factions that hated each other. Neutrality was power. Even in personal conduct, they practiced restraint. No public indulgence. No emotional outbursts. No obvious desperation for approval. Reputation was currency. Silence increased perceived value. When a tycoon finally spoke, people listened because silence had trained them to. Most importantly, they understood that money obeys psychology before it obeys math. Fear moves faster than logic. Greed blinds faster than ignorance. And confidence, when quiet and consistent, attracts allies like gravity. The tycoons engineered trust not through words but through reliability. They delivered every time, slowly at first, then predictably, then inevitably. This chapter is uncomfortable because it reveals a truth few want to accept. Wealth is not distributed fairly. It flows toward those who understand human behavior, timing, and restraint. The ancient tycoons didn't win by working harder than everyone else. They won by seeing what others refused to see, and by waiting when others could not tolerate waiting. And here is the lesson hidden between the lines. If you feel impatient, reactive, emotionally pulled by headlines and trends, you are playing the visible game. The ancient tycoons played the invisible one. And the invisible game always decides who owns the visible world. Sit with that. Let it settle. Because once you see timing, power, and psychology clearly, you can never unsee them again. Chapter 5. The Hidden Patterns of Influence and Wealth. Wealth, as the ancient tycoons understood it, was never merely the accumulation of coins, grain, or precious metals. It was the mastery of pattern recognition. Everything in the world moves according to patterns. Markets, human behavior, alliances, conflict, opportunity, fear, and desire. Those who could see these patterns long before they were obvious held the ultimate advantage, because patterns dictate outcomes even before they happen, and most people live their entire lives reacting to the aftermath, never recognizing the invisible forces that had already decided the results. The tycoons' power lay not in brute force or luck, but in their ability to predict, to act ahead of trends, to anticipate shifts that others could not imagine, and to position themselves so that every ripple in society became a lever for accumulation. They studied people, not just money. They understood that every individual, every ruler, every merchant acted according to recurring impulses. Greed, fear, ambition, desire for recognition, and fear of loss are constants that span cultures, centuries, and continents. The tycoons observed these constants and made decisions accordingly. They knew, for example, that when grain prices rise suddenly, panic will follow. When taxes increase subtly, merchants will overextend and take risks they otherwise wouldn't. When a ruler makes a public promise, they will overcommit resources to meet perception, creating vulnerabilities. By observing these patterns, the tycoons did not merely participate in events. They orchestrated them invisibly, nudging markets, alliances, and outcomes without ever appearing involved. Timing, once again, was everything. But timing without understanding human psychology is empty. The tycoons could wait decades for a market, for a trade route, or for an alliance to mature, because they understood patience is not passive, it is strategic positioning in motion. They created influence silently, planting seeds in business, politics, and social networks that would sprout years or even generations later. While the impatient or the greedy rushed to grab what appeared immediate, the tycoons built structures that endured, knowing that true advantage compounds quietly, often unnoticed until it is unassailable. They understood that those who act without foresight are enslaved by circumstance, while those who position in alignment with patterns are freed from its unpredictability. Influence was another cornerstone. Influence was often invisible, intangible, but more powerful than any army or treasure. The tycoons did not buy loyalty with money alone, they earned it with strategic generosity, timing, and calculated reciprocity. They gave resources when it mattered most, not to show power, but to create obligation and dependence subtly. A merchant whose livelihood depended on your protection would align with you naturally, often before knowing they were doing so. A ruler whose crisis was alleviated quietly by your resources owed their peace of mind and, indirectly, their future decisions to you. These quiet acts created networks of allegiance that extended far beyond immediate recognition, and once the tycoon held these networks, they could leverage them at will, without confrontation or overt displays of dominance. Ancient tycoons also excelled in risk architecture. Risk is the illusion that drives most people into overextension and failure. Tycoons understood that risk is not avoided, but managed strategically. They calculated probabilities based on both tangible factors, such as supply, logistics, and political stability, and intangible factors, such as human behavior, loyalty, and perception. They never relied solely on brute force or chance. Instead, they mitigated exposure, diversified their influence across regions, people, and ventures, and ensured they could absorb shocks without losing momentum. While others were paralyzed by fear or seduced by apparent opportunity, tycoons thrived by understanding the invisible dynamics of consequence and positioning themselves to benefit from volatility rather than be destroyed by it. The mastery of scarcity, influence, and timing came together with the tycoons' understanding of information asymmetry. They controlled the flow of knowledge long before digital networks existed. Information is currency, and those who possess it before others do enjoy immense advantage. Ancient tycoons never revealed their full holdings, intentions, or strategies. They allowed rumors, partial truths, and uncertainty to circulate while they acted on complete understanding. A delayed shipment, a whispered favor, or an unseen agreement could ripple through society in ways that created advantage long before outsiders recognized what was happening. They understood that knowledge allows you to act with confidence while others act emotionally, and that this emotional imbalance produces leverage in all human systems. Patience was intertwined with boredom, another trait misunderstood by modern observers. The tycoons cultivated boredom, because boredom forces the mind to observe, to notice subtle patterns, and to explore connections overlooked by those seeking constant stimulation. They could endure long stretches of waiting, knowing that most competitors would tire, become restless, and act impulsively. And when the critical moment arrived, the tycoons' patience magnified their effectiveness. An action that might seem ordinary to the uninformed observer could yield extraordinary results because it had been informed by decades of observation and quiet preparation. While others reacted to crises, tycoons anticipated and preempted them. While others chased trends, tycoons shaped the conditions that made the trends profitable. One of the most remarkable features of these tycoons was their mastery of human networks, not as transactional tools, but as dynamic systems. Relationships were never linear to them. They were multidimensional, spanning time, geography, loyalty, and obligation. They mapped alliances across generations, building redundancy into every connection. If one alliance broke, another absorbed its function. If one city fell into chaos, influence elsewhere compensated. Children, apprentices, and protégés were trained not just in commerce, but in observation, discretion, and strategic thought. Influence, once earned, was safeguarded through careful grooming and the cultivation of trust across multiple channels. These networks were resilient and adaptive, surviving upheaval that would destroy simpler structures. In addition, the ancient tycoons exploited perception as a tool of wealth. They understood that perception often dictates value more than reality. If a resource seems rare, its perceived worth rises, regardless of actual abundance. If a tycoon appears calm and unshakable during market turmoil, confidence flows to them, and trust consolidates around their decisions. If generosity is timed correctly, gratitude compounds faster than capital. They manipulated not only events, but also the stories and images that others told about them. Reputation was constructed deliberately, reinforced consistently, and maintained invisibly. One quiet act, perfectly timed, could ripple through society and yield far greater returns than overt displays of wealth or power. Lastly, they were masters of enduring through transitions. Dynasties rise and fall, rulers change, currencies devalue, wars happen. But the tycoons structured wealth in ways that transcended transient circumstances. Land, influence, information, and human networks were layered to survive chaos. Their wealth was not tied to one ruler, one market, or one era. Instead, it was embedded in human nature and the flow of societies, making it resilient. While the world above them swirled in turmoil, the tycoons were calm, calculating, and prepared, ready to act when opportunities emerged from the wreckage of those who failed to plan beyond immediate gains. This chapter exposes the core patterns of ancient tycoon mastery, observing human behavior and cycles, controlling perception and information, leveraging networks and loyalty, and acting with patience while others rush. Those who can see these patterns today, apply them consciously, adapt them to modern structures, and combine them with discipline, can operate in ways most people cannot even comprehend. These are not tricks or luck. They are the architecture of influence, wealth, and enduring power. Chapter 6. Invisible Control, Risk Mastery, and the Architecture of Enduring Wealth. Wealth is a story told not in gold coins or land deeds, but in control, timing, and the subtle manipulation of human behavior. The ancient tycoons understood that true power is invisible, silent, and unassuming. It does not shout, it does not demand attention, and it does not make itself obvious. Those who built enduring fortunes did so by constructing layers upon layers of influence, networks, information, and leverage, all carefully hidden beneath the surface of everyday life. To the casual observer, they seemed fortunate, lucky, or simply skilled. But what they actually did was architect reality itself, bending the forces of commerce, politics, human desire, and scarcity toward outcomes they had already anticipated. The first and most important principle they mastered was control over the unseen levers of society. Every market, every alliance, every opportunity can be influenced, but only by those who understand which levers to pull and when. Grain, for example, was not merely stored or sold, it was timed, measured, and positioned to create perception of scarcity. Caravans were not just routes, they were information highways. Anyone controlling them could understand supply, predict shortages, and exploit timing before competitors even noticed the shift. Political power was not sought directly. Instead, tycoons positioned themselves as indispensable to rulers through loans, advice, protection, or mediation, creating obligations that could be called upon years later. And in all cases, visibility was minimized. The more the world saw you, the more they could resist, envy, or disrupt you. Silence was a weapon. Risk, as we understand it today, was not calculated with spreadsheets or algorithms. It was observed in patterns of human behavior and nature. Tycoons understood that risk does not exist in a vacuum. It exists as a function of human emotion, timing, and leverage. Wars, plagues, political upheaval, and economic disruption were not disasters for them, they were diagnostic tools. Each disruption revealed weakness, impatience, or overconfidence in others, and tycoons positioned themselves to benefit from both chaos and stability simultaneously. They never acted impulsively. They waited, sometimes for years. And when the opportunity matured, they executed with precision that looked like instinct, but was actually the result of meticulous observation, analysis, and patience. Information asymmetry was perhaps their greatest advantage. Knowledge that is hidden from others is power, knowledge that is acted upon while others panic is wealth. Tycoons cultivated networks that provided early warnings about price shifts, political changes, and social movements. They listened to rumors, observed behaviors, and identified emerging patterns that the public and even rulers overlooked. And while information flowed, they did not reveal the extent of their understanding. They never broadcast insight, because revealing knowledge reduces leverage. Instead, they acted quietly, appearing patient, calm, and reactive, while in reality, every move had been anticipated and planned long in advance. Leverage itself was multidimensional. They leveraged people, relationships, capital, trade, geography, and perception simultaneously. A single alliance could create multiple forms of leverage if positioned correctly. For example, marrying into a family could provide loyalty, access to land, and a reputation that opened doors across regions. Lending discreetly to a ruler could create obligations that outlasted a reign. Controlling storage or supply chains allowed them to create scarcity that magnified both fear and demand. Leverage was multiplicative, not linear, and Tycoons understood the compounding effect of human behavior as well as capital. The control of perception was subtle but transformative. Ancient Tycoons understood that value exists not in reality but in belief. Scarcity, necessity, trust, fear, admiration, all are constructs of perception, and when perception is controlled, wealth is automatic. If people believe a resource is limited, they will pay more or act faster. If they believe a tycoon is indispensable, loyalty and influence accumulate naturally. If fear is delayed just enough, panic can be monetized strategically, and if generosity is timed perfectly, it creates obligation that compounds across generations. Every action, even in small measure, was positioned to shape perception without revealing intent. Patience was a weapon few understand today. Waiting is often interpreted as inaction, laziness, or cowardice, but to the ancient tycoon, it was strategic. The slow accumulation of insight, relationships, and positioning was far more valuable than short-term gains. They waited until conditions were perfect, not because they were lucky, but because they understood the unseen rhythms of power, supply, human desire, and political cycles. They used boredom as a tool. Periods of inactivity were used to observe patterns, measure alliances, and test loyalty. Impatience destroys architecture. Patience preserves it and magnifies its effect exponentially. Obligation and loyalty were cultivated as quietly as gold was stored. Tycoons never forced allegiance, they built it subtly through repeated, well-timed acts of assistance, protection, or generosity. People who received help in moments of crisis, who were protected during famine or war, who were given support quietly, without public recognition, became loyal almost unconsciously, and that loyalty could be activated decades later. This created networks of influence that outlasted empires, rulers, and even generations, and loyalty, once built properly, compounds faster than money itself. Finally, they mastered the interplay of time and continuity. Ancient tycoons did not think in months or even years, they thought in decades and generations. They built estates, alliances, and influence structures that could survive turbulence, disasters, and regime changes. They understood that wealth built for a single lifetime is fragile, but wealth built for centuries, using human nature as its foundation, is nearly indestructible. Time became the silent partner of every decision. Patience amplified leverage, silence magnified power, and repeated observation of patterns ensured that the structures they built endured beyond their lifetimes. The ancient tycoons understood that every decision is a thread in an enormous web. Pull the wrong thread and the web unravels. Pull the right thread at the right moment and the web tightens, supporting everything else automatically. Wealth, power, and influence were not the result of a single brilliant act. They were the cumulative result of thousands of small, patient, invisible acts, each aligned with the patterns of human behavior, natural cycles, perception, and timing. To this day, their methods are relevant, the tools have changed, but human nature remains the same. Scarcity, patience, loyalty, perception, timing, leverage, risk, these forces still determine outcomes. Money, influence, and opportunity still flow toward those who understand and manipulate these patterns quietly, patiently, and invisibly. Those who rush, panic, or fail to observe remain trapped in cycles of mediocrity, even with all the resources at their disposal. The ancient tycoons were not merely businessmen or merchants, they were architects of reality. They designed their lives, networks, influence, and decisions like master builders, constructing structures invisible to most, but unshakable over centuries. And in studying them, one realizes that wealth is not about luck, effort, or brilliance alone. It is about alignment with enduring patterns, patient execution, invisible influence, and strategic understanding of human nature. Every act of preparation, observation, and patient positioning compounds silently. Every loyalty built, every perception shaped, every risk measured becomes a layer of the invisible architecture. And when the world moves, when crises arrive, when empires rise and fall, those who have constructed their foundation properly, those who have mastered patience, leverage, timing, and influence will always emerge not merely surviving, but dominant, untouchable, and enduring. The tycoons leave us with a final truth. You cannot see the architecture until it is complete. You cannot understand the power until it is exercised. You cannot recognize patience until the impatient have acted and failed. But if you study these principles, if you internalize patience, leverage, timing, loyalty, risk, and perception, if you begin building quietly, invisibly, but intentionally, then you too can learn the patterns that govern enduring wealth, patterns that have survived empires, wars, and centuries, patterns that remain relevant in every era, including ours. Wealth is a structure, not a moment. Influence is invisible, not overt. Timing is everything, and patience is the multiplier. The ancient tycoons knew these things. And the secrets they mastered remain the blueprint for anyone seeking not temporary fortune, but enduring power.